Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Jack O'Meara, co-founder and CEO of Okra Bio.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jennifer Hawks-Bland, the CEO at New York Bio. As always, we are very glad you're joining us. We have a special guest today, and Jack O'Meara. We are going to talk entrepreneurship, early stage venture, company founding, and a whole lot in between. So special thank you to our sponsors for this month's series of breakfast, Fox Rothschild. We are very appreciative for their partnership. As always, from a housekeeping perspective, please ask your questions. We know you'll have questions for Jack throughout the course of our conversation. Put them in the Q&A or the chat, and Derek and I will get to them as we go throughout the conversation this morning. With that, I will turn it over to Derek to kick us off. Thanks so much.
All right, Jack, good morning. It's wonderful to have you here. We've got a little bit of everything today. We've got a coming to New York story. We have an origin story. We have international business. We can hit things from every single angle here. We've got fundraising. So in order to kind of lay the groundwork here, you've got a really interesting background. So why don't you kind of wind us through how you started as an entrepreneur, how you kind of got to the path that you're on now.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me, folks. Really looking forward to today's conversation. So I guess my journey, I'm Jack. I'm originally from Ireland. I grew up in a little town in the middle of Ireland called Athlone. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Home to the oldest pub in Ireland, though. That's our only claim to fame. And I was always quite interested in healthcare and kind of how things worked. I was a bit of a tinkerer as a kid, trying to re-engineer things. So I studied biomedical engineering on the west coast of Ireland in a lovely town called Galway, made famous for Galway Girl, if you know that song. And then was very interested and fascinated by how healthcare as a sector worked, but realized quite quickly that I probably wasn't suited for the lab. Started down a PhD route and kind of quickly took a step back when I was spending more time socializing with my lab mates and actually doing the work. So I then reprioritized and began to focus on how products actually come from a lab and get all the way to patients. I became really interested and enamored by the idea of what it takes to bring a new innovation from benchside to bedside, as it were. So I got an opportunity to go study in the US, brought me across the water, to do a program that focused on essentially teaching engineers and scientists how to do business, as it were. It was in Notre Dame, home to the Fighting Irish. There's a theme here. and study there for a little while before moving into a consulting role in the US, where I worked primarily in the healthcare sector across health technology, digital health, and in biotech. And then ended up at a wonderful little company at the time in north of Chicago called Avexis, where we were working on this sort of really interesting innovation in gene therapy, which went on to be Zolgensma and helped get that through the regulator and launch, which is a really inspiring journey to be on. And then, having kind of spent a lot of time in the US and was starting to worry I was getting an American accent, which was making me nervous, I said I need to get back closer to home. So I moved back to the UK. Wasn't quite ready for not a lot going on entrepreneurially or even biotechy in Ireland. So I spent time in London and met a wonderful co-founder that I work with today, who had a lot of big ideas around liver disease and how we could really make a big dent in chronic liver disease. If you can hear the ambulance going by. I live in London, busy streets. But and then we got together in 2019, and have been many years building Okra Bio since. It's been a really exciting journey since then. Hopefully that gives you a bit of the lay of the land.
And Jack, yeah. I can assure you have not lost your accent.
No, well, you're fine. You know, it's funny. I don't know what would be worse if you started to, if you go back to Ireland and you either sound like you're from Chicago or you sound like you're from London. I'm not clear to me which one of those things would cause more reverberations with the family.
More problems in Ireland, yeah.
Right. So as you kind of came in between, the US. So we're going to wind it back a little bit. So you had started something called Venture for Ireland, right? You had actually been, in between the US and Ireland, and you actually got this government program off the ground. So how did you kind of network your way into that? How did you kind of get something off the ground? Because a program like that, especially something that is, kind of government funded, you don't just really snap your fingers and make that happen.
Yeah, I guess I was, when I moved to the US, I was really inspired by the scale of everything. Having grown up in sort of out in the sticks in Ireland, things are a lot more slow paced and a lot less ambitious, as it were. So I became very excited by the industriousness and scale and ambition of working in the US, and I became quite obsessed with how do I get try and take that ethos and help inject a bit of that culture into the Irish entrepreneurial ecosystem. So while studying in Notre Dame, I spent a lot of time talking to the Irish development agencies and Irish government about this idea of helping graduates at the time come and spend some of their, do some work experience effectively with early stage, primarily startup and tech companies at the time. We partnered with a few folks out in California. Silicon Valley had a big appeal at that point, to try and get basically internships for recent graduates out of Ireland. And we matched them with mentors, largely Irish American or Irish entrepreneurs in the US, to help sort of cultivate and this idea of an entrepreneurial spirit, as it were, I guess. And yeah, after a lot of knocking on doors and speaking with the American Embassy and others to try and get them excited, we managed to get some funding from the Irish government, which was really wonderful, and place a number of students, or recent graduates, I should say, in tech companies in the US, which was, again, yeah, really interesting first lesson in entrepreneurship, learning the basics of that space.
I feel like that there's been a long history of having Irish students come to the US.
Yeah.
I have friends that did that, but more like for summers and in the hospitality, not necessarily post grad.
Yeah, well, this is sort of, I guess what I was observing at the time, because a lot of my friends were coming over at the time to work in pubs or whatever, and they're all studying biomedical engineering or PhDs and whatnot. And I was like, why are you working in a pub? Like, get a really great experience working in one of these innovative, like globally impactful companies, and take that and bring it back with you. So that was sort of a lot of the thesis behind the program.
Yeah.
So your initial foray into healthcare, though, actually, interestingly enough, it wasn't biotech, it was digital health. So if we wind back to 2016 or so, you worked with Comcast and Blue Cross, and this was, I think, probably before. I think this was this was pretty much in the heady days of digital health as a buzzword, where everyone was excited about it, but people weren't exactly sure what to do. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how that came together, and almost kind of what you saw within the digital health stuff that either was a little early back then or changed now?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting time, and it was like blank page type project, which was super fun to be a part of in a very well resourced organization like Comcast. So that can be a great thing, but also maybe a curse in some ways. And yeah, it was at a point when there was a lot of excitement in the space around digital health. So essentially, I imagine what happened was Comcast, one of the senior execs of Comcast, saw this as a big opportunity and wasn't quite exactly sure what they needed to do to get a program launched. So put together a sort of skunkworks team, as it were, to start to map out the space and see where Comcast, given its might fit into the sector. Yeah, I think as maybe I alluded, and I'm going to be careful what I say here, but when you have this hyper well resourced startup effectively in an area that still hasn't really figured out its feet as a sector more generally, we ended up going in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot of grand, ambitious statements around reimagining healthcare, but not a lot of clarity on what that meant at the time. And I think
what were they trying to do exactly? Because this is Comcast, right? This is effectively a cable company, right? So what exactly were they trying to do?
So the initial, when I was working on it, a lot of the idea was around health education for how to navigate the convoluted US healthcare system. And we were working on some videos with the Today Show and some of the kind of wider Comcast network to put together educational materials for folks. And also we had talked a lot about health trackers and health monitors, but we're having difficulty sort of driving adoption for people at that point. And that was one of the big kind of observations I had around digital health. It's a really tough space, because oftentimes people don't really want treatment until they're sick. That's changing a lot now as people are more proactively monitoring their health. But then it felt like we were working on these products, and then no one was really taking the initiative no one wanted to actually use them proactively. Now that I
Right.
think that has changed a lot. So I think the sector is really beginning to mature and find its feet. But at that point, when we were throwing ideas around like doctor on your TV, which is kind of fun idea, but didn't really take off in the end. And yeah, I mean, I think I haven't been involved. It was a long time ago. It was right at the beginning. So it was sort of exciting and huge learning. But I think the challenge really was clarity of vision at that point.
Yeah.
If you think about it, was this after the NBC Universal purchase, right? So you had network, so you had content generation, you had delivery, right? In Comcast, but yet how do you narrow it down? Like it was almost blue sky, right?
That's what I felt was, and that's sort of one of the really interesting things was that when you have really blue sky and sort of endless resources, it actually can be a curse because you really want this massive impactful project, but oftentimes, that's what I guess why I see in a lot of these companies teach you is focus on something really niche, really narrow, get some progress, and then incrementally build out from there. Interesting.
You know, it's very difficult. Usually the thing that gets adopted is not necessarily the thing that you start with. And, you know, especially if you have all this money behind the vision, it's really, you know, you have a well to spend, right? If you have nothing to spend and you have to go with the thing that's actually getting uptake, that's a lot different than, you know, if we just do it a little bit better, if we just push a little bit harder, you can spend a lot of time trying to find your audience, so to speak. And I think the important thing too is that the rest of the sector probably wasn't really ready, right? You know, there have been enough kind of digital health venture dollars spent on teams that either didn't develop a product or couldn't drive revenue. Like the initial learnings, the failures, if you will, that everybody, you know, kind of then puts in their back pocket and says, okay, if you can't really do it like this, hadn't really happened yet. So there's blue sky with really no customer accountability and no learning to fall back on. It's just kind of, well, we think this might be the way it's going to work, or we hope it will. And, you know, I think a lot of that has changed in the last 6 years.
Hugely agree.
Yeah, and we had a question that said, okay, in hindsight, right, given what you know today, what should Comcast have done then in digital healthcare?
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's a toughie. I don't have a great answer for that one. I guess the only thing I would say though is, and this is more just a reflection on the how things were evolving there, is to pick something and then do that thing well, and then add on and bolt on more things. And if that is something like Doctor on your TV, get it to a functional space and then begin to bolt on. I think the challenge for a big organization like that is, and it's also a kind of a cultural thing. And it was really interesting, sort of, you know, you hear all these books that big companies struggle to innovate, and startups, a lot of the innovation. You see that in biopharma, right? In a big way. And there is sort of this a big culture mentality of not wanting to bet the house on one thing, and wanting to try and hedge your bets and sort of stay at the clouds, and we're going to change on a massive scale, but not really taking the initiative, not really feeling comfortable enough or to take a bet really deep on one particular area. So I think that would have been my counsel.
Well, it's funny, the other edge of that sword is that if, you know, a company like Comcast really, you know, kind of focuses and does one thing well, the people that are doing kind of business development and things like, well, that opportunity is not big enough. Why are we doing this if it doesn't get us to this huge like revenue bump? If we do this in focus, it's just not going to be that big of an opportunity for us. So it's really odd that the thing that will very likely get you to, you know, actual success and being able to build on it is a thing that would never be attractive to the people that decide what you do as a business anyway.
And that was exactly what the senior leadership who kept talking about was, you know, we have to move the needle at Comcast, which is a $40 billion a year. It has to be $1 billion opportunity. But then it's sort of, that's maybe the tension in big company innovation. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yes, going to a $40 billion.
Every entrepreneur would like to have that problem.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly.
They would figure it out. They would say.
Yeah, there would definitely be something that gets to something somewhere. All right. So let's go from digital health actually to biotech. So how did you get from Comcast and digital health over to Avexis?
So it was through a contact we met who was doing a lot of, it's actually based out of New York. It's a consulting firm called SSI, Strategy Acquis Consulting Group. They do a lot of, so they had an opportunity at Avexis and we're looking for someone to come in and support the team. And we connected with them, and they set up a series of interviews and ended up flying over to Chicago and kind of based myself there for over a year, which was a really exciting project to be a part of.
Yeah. Chicago is lovely in the fall and late spring.
Chicago is lovely.
Yep.
It was the double polar vortex year though. And it was we had a lot of regulatory inspections at that time, and the FDA were literally coming through. We had to drive them in because no taxis were running.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So it was like this bizarrely cold experience. But
right. So you were working on Zolgensma, right? Which is really probably, I would say, if not the first, one of the first kind of blockbuster gene therapies, right? So you're working on something that basically doesn't really have a precedent. You're working in spinal muscular atrophy, which was a disease that literally had no cures, no treatment for kids, really. So can you describe what was the feeling like inside the company? Because at the time did you have pivotal results already or no?
We had pivotal results already.
Okay.
So there were some amazing results coming out. We had people come and visit and do the recipients of the treatment coming to talk about and the families. I mean, it was like the most inspiring place to work ever. It was a hugely, I mean, I guess to contrast it with the previous experience where it was big vision, but not a lot of clarity. This was like laser focused. Everyone knew what they needed to do. Everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet. The mission and the kind of roadmap to get there was super clear and super inspiring, and it was a really, really amazing kind of team and culture to be a part of. This is maybe I say this sometimes to the team in the UK, and they kind of go, "That's so American," but like there'd be literally people high-fiving in the hallway, like saving another baby today as they're like developing the packaging up a product, and it was like it was just really, really inspiring to be a part of.
Yeah. I can imagine. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, I was just saying, we on our webinar, we spent a lot of time talking about patients, and talk to me about how it was, because not many people benefit from having patients come in and talk to the teams that are trying. And I'm assuming these were clinical trial patients at that point.
Yeah, they're clinical trial patients.
Yeah. So talk to us about how impactful that was to the team at AveXis.
I mean, it's hard to, we had posters all over the walls around all of the sites with images and stories and kind of background on the individuals who were part of the clinical trials and who are benefiting from it. And that was, again, that's part of the high five in the hallway type of culture, I think, that enabled it. And yeah, it's hard to put to words how meaningful it is to meet a patient, a child that's essentially told you that your work has saved their life. I mean, it's hard to like even articulate how profoundly impactful that is as someone working there, irrespective of janitor to CEO. It's just a really moving thing to be a part of. So that was a hugely powerful piece of the culture and really helped to drive everyone towards that goal.
Really just can't get it out of my head how absolutely American high-fiving in the hallway is, and how British people would my wife is British, and how people would basically react to high-fiving in the hallway. That is absolutely perfect on so many levels.
It's been such an interesting transition for me coming back from working in the US, because like I use a lot, like we used to say silly things like one team, one dream, like ironically, but in a funny way. But that in Britain is just like, British people are so like, no, like don't say that. just too cliche.
Not even in jest.
Yeah, not even in jest. Too cliche. Yeah, but I love it. That kind of energetic, enthusiastic. I love that. I'm trying to bring some of that. I don't know if I'm going on a tangent here, but I don't know if you guys watch Ted Lasso.
It's the best.
It's so true. Like that is literally the cultural dynamics of the US and the UK. Like it's so funny to watch that show, because I can just there's lots of things like that people are just like, what are you saying? Like,
I can very honestly say that we do not have time for this tangent. I can talk about this tangent for quite some time. We can't. I'm just going to cut it off now. So why don't we talk about
before we transition that if you're able to save children's lives, then you can Ted Lasso the heck out of anything you want.
Absolutely.
Hell yes.
Absolutely.
I totally agree.
Okay, So Ochre Bio, how did you, where did it come from and how did it start? And there's a Y Combinator stint in here too. So why don't we talk a little bit about how that company got off the ground?
Cool. So yeah, so I my story was I came back to London, had kind of left the States, was working on my Irish accent, as I said, and met my partner in crime, Quinn Wills, who has been in the liver drug development space for 20 years. He was formerly head of liver genomics for Novo Nordisk, doing a lot of fundamental discoveries, big fundamental discovery guy using a lot of advanced spatial single cell sequencing. That's kind of how he built his career.
Okay.
So we got together and we're talking about some of my work in the past and what his passions were. And he left Novo at this point and was looking to do something new. And then we really got excited about this idea of thinking about chronic liver disease, which is a big challenge. And I'm sure you guys are aware it's been a difficult space for drug developers. Every NASH drug has been a failure. Largely for a couple of reasons that got me excited about working with them to try and solve this problem. The biology of chronic diseases, not unlike neurodegeneration and others, is still so poorly understood. And a lot of these new genomic tools are enabling us to, with a higher fidelity, understand the biology. So that was a lot of what Quinn's work had been before. But then equally, the other two challenges that we thought we would have a big impact on were number two, the models that are used for chronic liver disease, like mice models, just don't predict how drugs are going to perform in the clinic. I mean, every NASH drug works wonderfully in a mouse. And then the clinical trials themselves are really difficult because the endpoints are messy, and the regulator has been very flexible on that. So we thought about this idea of using only human-based models to validate new therapeutics. So that means from precision slices of diseased liver tissue through the actual discarded donor livers, so livers that can't be used for transplant because they have early stage NASH, keeping them alive on these new transplant machines that effectively just pump them with blood and oxygen and treat them like they're in a body outside the body. So this is an idea of having a better preclinical tool to validate therapeutics, but then also thinking about clinical trials differently. So we don't go directly into a NASH trial where the endpoints are a mess and it's really high risk. We're initially focusing on improving outcomes for liver transplant patients by pre-treating marginal donor livers and then stepping stone our way into larger diseases like NASH and so forth. So trying to take a focused, not I guess, unlike how a lot of the gene therapy platform companies think about a first orphan indication to get some initial evidence before moving into a larger disease space.
No, that's really interesting because it strikes me that you've looked at all of the places that systematically make this, incredibly difficult if you do it, with precedent, right? And you've actually just taken it, stripped it down to human biology. It's like, well, if the mouse models are no good, why are we using a mouse? Right. And if the clinical trials are, why are we doing it this way? Why aren't we doing it in something that we actually understand? It really is kind of the reverse Comcast, right? You're actually stripping everything else away and kind of starting from basic biology principles, which is exciting. So where does Y Combinator fit into this story?
So Quinn and I got together late 2019, and we initially started to do some fundraising in the UK and Europe, but I don't know if you know too much about the fundraising markets in the UK and Europe, but they're very slow and they're not very supportive of weird and unusual styled companies, and that which we sort of fit the bill. You got sort of a South African scientist with lots of big passionate ideas, and then young Irish guy who's kind of a lot of energy and enthusiasm. But so anyway, so it wasn't really a fit for the European biotech investor market. So we flew to California, and we got an interview very last minute. It was actually right before the program started, and we didn't think we were going to get in. And we had planned to just stay for a week and meet some people. It was JP Morgan, so we're going to try and do some meetings at that time as well, early 2020. And then we get this call as we're walking out saying, come back, you're in the program. We had like a week's worth of clothes. We had to buy all of our stuff and find a place to live for 3 months. So this kind of wild pivot. And it was 3 months in California leading and right before COVID happened, right? So that was the other nuance to it, but it was definitely the right decision. It really, they were tremendously helpful in helping us shape the pitch and helping us get in front of really investors that change the trajectory of the company in a very meaningful way. And yeah, the Y Combinator is a really fabulous program and with a lot of great supports and mentorship, and helps to shape the company from there.
What's it like being a bio company in Y Combinator?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of interesting thing. It's I think when we did it, we were maybe one of the earlier cohorts in the bio space, and
Yeah.
they were kind of finding their feet. They had this really great guy who worked a lot with us at the time called Uri Lopetin. He founded Assembly Biosciences. And he did a lot of the Ask One stuff at Gilead for NASH. So he's actually a
Okay.
real liver guy. So Uri worked a lot with us, and actually, which was he was only there for one cohort as well, which is kind of random that the liver
Yeah.
company, the liver guy for one group. But I mean, they've just built this amazing brand and reputation and investor base because they've had so much success. And then this idea of just running a parallel process, it's so simple, but it's so effective, where you don't talk to any investors for 3 months, and they're all kind of biting at trying to get a look in at the new companies, and then you just release yourself to like 1,000 investors simultaneously. It just changes the power dynamic in a way, because now all of a sudden you can create this marketplace for your fundraise, rather than sequentially trying to get people interested. It's like we're talking to everyone at the same time, so everyone get involved, and that idea is quite powerful, even in its simplicity.
Yeah.
That was a
Yeah.
big benefit.
And very often it's the opposite of what people do, right? You start on this journey and you have what you have when you start, and then people, they're interested, but they want to see more. And it's not quite death by 1,000 paper cuts, but there's always a little bit more to show somebody. There's this kind of long,
Exactly.
relationship building thing, which, I don't know if data would bear out whether it's, useful or productive or not.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, it's very unclear, and there's always more you can see, right? That's the challenge with these things.
There's always another set. It's never finished. There's always another set of data, and there's always, one more person to convince. There's always kind of one more bit of diligence, and of course, it's not all done yet. If it was all done yet, if it was all done, we'd already have all of this stuff. That's why we know we have to do this.
Yeah.
What was so I know you've characterized Y Combinator as a big catalyst, right, for Ochre.
Yeah.
Was it more the human expertise that they helped you with? Was it the access to this 1,000, potential investors? What really made it a catalyst?
If I'm honest, I think it really was the investor, this idea of running a parallel fundraising process and having the tick symbol that Y Combinator somehow gives companies at a very early stage, because we're brand new, right? Like we're only around a few months at this point, and all of a sudden you go from 2 guys in a London pub kind of with this big idea to now you're a Y Combinator startup and in the demo day. And that sort of, even though nothing has fundamental, actually it was quite hilarious, because a lot of the investors that I've been pitching several months previously in London, who were like, I don't know, were then all of a sudden like, oh my God, no, we always knew you had it in you. We always like, let us talk now. And nothing has changed, like absolutely nothing has changed. But there's something about this human psychology that when all of a sudden a deal gets hot, or when there's a excitement around a new idea, investors, there's this sort of sheep mentality that people espouse sometimes. So yeah, that was, if I'm honest, that was a lot. I mean, and also the network of other founders, I mean, has been, even to this day, like I was just yesterday texting the WhatsApp group saying I have this SAB meeting, any advice for whether or not we should pay for first class flight, little questions and stuff like that that come up, and it's just always helpful to get insights from other founders who've been there.
Gave you an instant peer group, right?
Exactly,
and that's really
so valuable. So what happened at the end? So was there a gap in between Y Combinator and your seed fund? So were there people that got involved initially? What did your fundraising look like? Because you have a really cool fundraising story. Your seed was led by Khosla Ventures, big venture group, extremely well renowned. So how did you get from kind of Y Combinator to having those guys on your cap table?
Yeah, so it all happened. This is the benefit. It's one of the reasons why we could say, yeah, good decision to go over to California then, because it all happened very quickly right after that program. Within 3 or 4 weeks, we closed the majority of our seed round. We're able to get back and start hiring the team and start building out the organization. So we basically ran our process, and Khosla was top of the list. They've done a lot on this sort of intersection of new genomic tools and interrogating new biology, and like the idea of something a bit. Khosla's thesis is take a big swing at a big problem. So it's high risk, but if it works, it's high reward. And we see a lot of what we do as we're shooting for really complex, really impactful human health challenges, but we're taking really innovative and novel approaches to do that. So it's a good philosophical fit. And they're also, I mean, they have a reputation as no BS type characters, but we like directness. So that was a good sort of fit culturally for us. So yeah, so they led the seed. We got in touch with them quite quickly, and I think again because we had a lot of momentum at that point and had a lot of interest through the YC network, they were able to get to a term sheet very quickly, which wouldn't have been the case otherwise. Actually, this is again a slight tangent, but kind of a funny scene where I had to fly out of California because the UK borders were closing, so I flew back to Ireland at the time and was doing and I mean, it was COVID, so no one knew what was going on, so I went back to my home house in rural Ireland, which I hadn't been back to in like I hadn't been living in for like 12 years, and was in my childhood bedroom negotiating with Vinod Khosla around the terms of the deal, which just felt hilarious at the time. But yeah, we got initially 5 in from that round, and then quickly sort of wrapped in a large Taiwanese investor who came through a personal contact and was interested in the approach as well, and then that brought it up to the larger seed financing.
So I'll ask this, right? So you've got this firm that, you know, wants you to go after these huge opportunities, right? And obviously the way that you're going after it requires, there's a little bit of patience involved, right? Because you're doing things in kind of a stepwise fashion where what you do now is going to basically, you know, educate how you do everything else. So how do you communicate that, you know, that level of, you know, this is our plan to them, and how patient are they with that? Do they understand? And I don't think they're listening. I don't think Vinod is on the attendees thing here. Do they understand what the kind of stepwise, you know, kind of biological value creation is out of what you're doing, or are they going to really just start hammering you on like, when does it get big?
So we work primarily with Alex Morgan, who's one of the bio partners there, and his Twitter handle is Genomics Doc, so he's very sophisticated genomics guy. And I think this is one of the tricks that's been a big part of our learning and journey today. This very effective expectation setting is key to continued success as a company. So we were very clear. I mean, it's actually bizarre. I pulled up one of our first decks that we put together in 2019, and it's like we're still on the timeline we had projected then, which is like, oh wow, mental. That's
rare. That's pretty good.
That is like super rare. But we talked a lot about the first year or so being about generating a proprietary data set on chronic liver disease, so spatially sequencing 1,000 livers to give ourselves target insights into what we thought would really make an impact in the space. And then the second year about building out the models, so the discarded donor liver model, the precision slice model, and then this year, or this third year, around selecting what products, designing therapeutics that were ready to go into clinic, and then next year, or 2024, around actually getting into clinical trials. So that sort of timeline was mapped out very early on, and at each of those junctures you have proof points. So after our first year of working with COSA, we announced or kind of presented this 1,000 liver atlas, which is the largest, at the time, we think the largest genomic data set on the human liver that was aggregated through a partnership with the University of Oxford. And then more recently, we announced recently our lab in New York that's doing whole liver perfusion at a significant throughput now with a optimized protocol to maintain livers alive for 5 days, so we can test out new therapeutic interventions in that context. And then late next year, we'll be announcing actual therapeutic products that we want to move into clinical development. So we've been very clear from the outset, and there's been a lot of debate internally around what we think is feasible, but from an early stage, having a pretty clear and not overly ambitious. I think that's where companies get caught out. They over promise, under deliver. So being quite tight on giving ourselves the bandwidth to deliver on what we promised.
Well, you did just say the magic words, and you mentioned your lab in New York. So why don't we why don't we talk about that?
I was like, oh God, what did I
say? And so I want to talk about New York, but I also want to talk about building a company almost entirely throughout COVID.
Okay?
So talk to us about and you span 3 continents right now.
Yeah, that is a really unusual piece of this story, and it's driven by the fact that we the philosophy from early days was to do human tissue-based research. So we need to be distributed to get access to high throughputs of human tissues. But it does come with a lot of challenges. And I mean, even beyond just the time zones and trying to get call schedule, which is near impossible with 8-hour differences per location, is just the different cultures. We've got a team in Taipei that's entirely Taiwanese, well, one South African. And we've got a team in New York and a British team, which, as we talked about earlier, more reserved sort of personality phenotype. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about the cultural norms and articulating the values of the organization from a pretty early stage, but I think is borne fruit and been helpful as we begin to scale. And yeah, I mean, right from the beginning, we leaned a lot early on Quinn's personal contacts. He had a lot of contacts in liver science that joined the company early on, a lot of which came from Novo Nordisk, actually. But as we've scaled now, that's no longer the case. And we've been, it has been a challenge. It's been fun. It's been fun. We spent a lot of time in Zoom meetings. The challenge with Zoom is it's a bit transactional. But we do a lot of company updates and try to get people together for offsite meetings where possible. And nothing tremendously creative in here, but yeah, trying our best.
What made you, so I assume one of the impetuses for the Taiwanese location was your investor. Is that right?
So it was kind of a mixture of factors. Tess, the lady who leads our Taiwan team, did a lot of the single cell genomics work at Novo Nordisk originally, so had a background in this space. And we initially thought about bringing her on as a consultant to help us set some stuff up. But then when we looked into it, it was the healthcare system in Taiwan is a bit like the NHS, and there's a lot of rich historic data on tissue samples, and it's very cost effective. I mean, I think it's one of these markets that are undervalued by the globally, so you get great talent over there. And yeah, we had an investor who was interested in us, who was Taiwanese origin, so was supportive of opening a lab there. But it's been a really wonderful investment. I mean, the team there have been producing phenomenal data, and have just been a total joy to work with. And it's been a really positive decision, actually.
Despite that you're doing calls at odd hours,
that's the only challenge. Yeah, that's the only challenge. We haven't really been able to figure out that, though. I don't know if there is a way to figure that out. We record everything. I guess one of the nuances that is a bit different because we're so global is we record every big meeting, and every meeting is then made available for people to watch in their own time. So things like that we've been very intentional about.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking before, you said you spatially sequenced 1,000 livers, and I've actually set up things like that in the past. I don't know if it's for those that are not used to it, that's a very big number. To get 1,000 of anything is actually really, really hard. So I don't know, you can talk about how you got the throughput to do that, but that's a massive number of clinical samples. I imagine that was either really difficult, or you have set up this amazing pipeline that is just super efficient with that, and you did it in a year.
We did it all. This started in June 2020 and I finished in January, February 2021. So in less than 9 months, we massive genomic data set. That's all over amazing. COVID too. And I mean, like, we're dealing with shipments from Austria to London, San Diego, and it's like in that time, even trying to get shipping arranged was a total.
Wait, so you shipped these from different countries to be able to do them?
There was no spatial sequencing commercially available at the time because it was sort of pre-Visium and such. So we had to develop our own tools. So we worked with a company in San Diego that had an imaging AI tool that was able to annotate different regions. And then there's a company in California that was able to do sort of spatial lysing of cells, so we could get specific regions of cells. And then they went to Austria for sequencing, and then we did all the analytics in Oxford. And the samples were through a partnership with the Oxford University, one of the biobanks there.
Okay, yeah, no, I was going to say, because figuring out where and what patients those come from is really, really difficult. That's an amazing amount of throughput.
Yeah. And we've been doing a lot in Taipei now since setting that up. That's even bigger scale. We get regular biopsies on a weekly basis through partnerships with hospitals there. So it's been, that's been a big focus of the company since the beginning is high throughput tissues.
That's amazing. I mean, if anybody that has ever done anything in sample procurement will tip their hat to you. That's an incredible feat.
Yeah, it was a lot of sleepless nights that first year. We're getting where things are getting more leveled now, we mature, but.
And that's where you were able to leverage Quinn's extensive network, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one of the kind of key first partners was the person who actually invented organ perfusion. He's the head of transplant medicine at Oxford. Peter Friend is his name. He developed this technology that keeps organs alive ex vivo. So he was sort of a key partner as we got the company off the ground and was able to help us get partnering with the local biobanks and so on.
Okay. All right. So if we wind back, why did you come to New York?
Yeah, so we actually did a I guess was it early last year, we did a sort of tour of all the East Coast. We initially looked at San Francisco, but the time zones were just already too painful. So it's definitely East Coast. And we did a sort of road tour to visit different sites and look at different areas. And we initially thought about Boston, but a lot of our focus was to try and get to a center with a very rich diversity of tissue samples, essentially, so we can try and build a wide view of how different ethnicities respond to therapeutic interventions. And New York is such a melting pot. It's been an amazing location, and it actually was cheaper to do so in New York than it was at the time to move to Boston, which is kind of crazy because you're downtown New York. And also we made some amazing connections, and the lady who leads our New York site came out of Mount Sinai. So great sort of context to the local, and a lot of computational biology expertise in the New York region more generally. So it was a good sort of philosophical fit. And yeah, I think New York's the up and coming scene. You know, if you're going to be this kind of unusual, quirky company that's doing things a little differently and novel, why go and be I think the bet is rather than go be a tiny fish in a really competitive pond like Boston, go try and build a new ecosystem and do something different and sort of live by that ethos. So we thought New York was sort of up and coming, exciting place to begin to build the biotech sector.
We would agree.
Yeah. I mean, it's way more. This is the other thing. This is like a personal thing. This obviously from a commercial perspective not influence the decision. But if I was going to live anywhere, I think New York is there's so much more going on. It's such a really multifaceted, interesting city. I think companies are more interested in that rather. Boston is a little bit, I don't know, what's the word? Samey. I don't know. I feel like New York is really diverse, interesting, kind of more things, artworks and more to do for people who want to live there rather than Boston.
Yeah. And for clarity, we don't actually, pay any of our guests to say these things. We don't fill them in beforehand. I realize Maria gave the same kind of defense last week, and we believe it's true. Really? But yeah, no, this is unprompted.
I mean, I think companies are going to increasingly over the next decade want to be in places where there's a much more robust like life to them. And I think New York is like the most interesting city in the world potentially.
I mean, and to be fair though, like when you're recruiting people, like New York is interesting, but there's also a lot of other opportunity for partners or spouses or families. Exactly.
We
have a lot of diversity, which is welcoming to a larger number of people in many circles.
I totally agree.
So what was your process like to find lab space, right? We now have this luxury of having more lab space than we've ever had here in the past. So as somebody who's kind of built and set up here, what was that process like? Did you kind of go and see everything? I imagine as a new company, people were kind of fighting over getting you into their facilities.
Yeah, we were treated like, this is one of the things that in Boston, no one does any, you're fighting to get a look in. Whereas in New York, you're treated like a king. People are touring you around, want to show you different spaces. And we had one friend, Kat Donaldson, I don't know if she was on this before.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, she was great for giving us sort of tips and tricks and advice on where to go see. And then we got a really wonderful deal through the biolabs setup. And I mean, it's a phenomenal kind of industrial chic space right down in Manhattan. So I mean, it's an amazing facility and very affordable for what you get. So it was great. We really had a easy transition, soft landing in New York.
Well, it's very nice to hear, because for a long time it wasn't like that, right? I mean, for a long time, Boston, I suppose you have to fight for getting into any lab space whatsoever. For a long time here, it just kind of didn't exist. And now we have multiple options and more coming online. So that's really good to hear that the actual process it sounds like it was efficient, and it sounds like you were able to get something that fit, which is really great to hear.
Absolutely.
So obviously, like the diversity of New York, we also have I think it's, I would say 9 world-class academic medical institutions here, right? How does that play in to what you're trying to do with your labs in New York?
So we partnered, I know this isn't New York specific, but we partnered very closely with Yale. So that's a little bit, not too far from New York.
It's regional.
It's close enough. It's
regional,
basically a
yeah.
suburb.
Give it credit.
And we obviously have ties to Mount Sinai and a couple of others. So the access to talent was a big attraction from that perspective, but also having, because we work a lot with, we hired in transplant surgeons, actually one from Columbia as well, who's amazing, to run these perfusion studies. So having access to that expertise, it was a big draw for the space. And yet Yale was sort of a de facto twin part. We have a lab in New York, and we work very closely with the lab at Yale that does a lot of the same type of organ perfusion research, and they had a real expertise in the field of organ perfusion research, which was a large draw as well, actually.
So what's next? I imagine you've said that you want to transition to trying to put some compounds into the clinic in 2023, 2024, which is also a fast timeline. But I imagine, number one, there's capital needs for that. Number two, I imagine your company is going to have to get bigger, right? You're going to have to actually get the people to either your clinical team or your external folks. How do you imagine your company growing, and what are kind of the next things that you see get falling into place?
Yeah, so it has been this sort of stepwise process to build out the team. We started a lot with the data side and computational tools, and increasingly built out these models to validate them. We recently, I haven't actually done a press release or anything, but we recently launched a whole chemistry team on Oxford Science Park in the UK. We brought in the head of UK's MRC RNA Therapeutics Institute to lead that. So a really strong state-of-the-art RNA synthesis and design group there that actually can optimize these therapeutic compounds. And then the next big hire for us will be around a sort of GMP translational medicine hire to help us get all of the ducks in a row for IND submissions and getting into the clinic. And then over probably end of next year, we'll look for more of a CMO type personality to build out an actual clinical operations function. So each year we're adding a new wing to the organization, adding a new function. We're essentially step by step building out a large pharmaceutical manufacturer, which is exciting.
Yeah.
And so like this, I feel like this is an inflection point for many companies. Do you partner, with a company that, like, especially when you're talking about commercialization, right? I think that's always a big question. Talk to us about your thoughts now around commercialization down the road.
Yeah, so it's really program specific for us. So we've begun to add in earlier stage. We announced recently earlier programs beyond the lead and transplant with a view to NASH. And for each program, I think the strategy will be slightly different. We don't necessarily want to be a transplant company long term, but we have great partnerships with transplant companies now, like Organox, who designed the perfusion device and have built out a whole sales force that's globally well recognized to get products into the transplant market. So that might be an obvious partner for a transplant product. And then in NASH, kind of as you described, NASH is such a big indication. 1 in 4 people have some element of NASH. And it's not something that's going to be tractable for a very early stage company to build a sales force or even do late stage clinical trials for. So we'll likely
the volume.
Yeah, exactly. So post a phase 2, we'll likely look for a larger partner to help us build out that function. But then for other programs, like we've started some work in cancer and organ and liver regeneration with a view to cirrhosis, and some of those programs are more maybe a better viable as we think about what a commercial organization or commercial strategy might look like for the years to come. Might be a more tractable first product to help partner and build some of those expertise in-house. We do have grand ambitions to maintaining a very strong discovery capability, and that's a lot of what the company was born out of from an expertise perspective, but really building a large multi-product pharmaceutical company. So would ultimately like to get there.
So do you have an idea of what your first indications in the clinic are going to be now, or is that literally kind of the strategic stuff that you have to embark on over the next year?
We'll be having a lot of debates we are having a lot of debates around these things. I do the current thinking, and again, I should just to caveat this, we'll see where the data takes us over time, but the thesis has been that our first program will be in the transplant space with the view to improving outcomes for the use of for liver transplant patients. Essentially, donor organ quality has declined over the past 20 years quite a lot, actually, when you look at the numbers, because we're all living older, eating more unhealthily. organs, particularly livers, are actually fattier and more diseased by the time they're getting to transplant centers. But surgeons have to use them anyway because there is such a shortage, even though they have higher failure rates, it can be more challenging. So our first indication is essentially a pre-treatment to improve outcomes for the use of higher risk donor livers. You then to taking that product and stepping stone our way into larger diseases. Right. That's the thesis. That may change, as I said, but that's a lot of the thinking right now.
So well, you also rehabbing the liver in order for it to be more viable when it actually comes into the patient.
Yeah, exactly. Protecting, essentially protecting the liver from cell death, which is a lot of what drives failure.
Yeah.
And is your clinical outcome something along the lines of, you know, non-rejection, or you know, this is something that I imagine has a reasonably short endpoint that you could look at. It's also probably really definitive.
Yeah, so that's because these perfusion devices have been running similar trials, a lot of this is well agreed with the regulator, and peak liver enzymes 1 week post-transplant is a surrogate biomarker for early allograft dysfunction, so whether or not the organ will fail. So that will be the primary readout, and then secondary readout will be around. We look at recurrence rates of fatty liver disease, which are a big challenge in this population for patients who are transplanted for NASH, to see if our therapeutics would have a wider preventative treatment for fatty liver disease as well.
Is there anything that kind of, you know, NASH is so huge, is there anything that breaks it up? Does everyone, so asked a different way, does everyone get NASH the same way, or is NASH one of these diseases that's really complex and, you know, it kind of has a lot of different sub-diseases and subcategories in it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mess. There's so many different things going wrong. It all ends up in the same place, but the journey to get there is slightly different for each group. And there's genetics involved as well. I mean, like fatty liver disease in Asia is a very different disease than in the US. Patients can be very skinny and then have very fatty livers, which is not typically the case in Western population. So there's definitely nuances we're trying to evaluate, and that's a large part of the thesis, to get a really wide array of different ethnicities into our genomic data set to try and figure out what are the most widely applicable therapeutic indications, rather than we haven't been focused on stratifying patients as much as we have been trying to find a widely applicable therapeutic targets.
So we have a good question here, which is why pick the name and the trademark for ochre, e.g., you know, clay dirt earth?
Clay dirt earth.
Yeah, where did the name come from? I don't know. What's the origin of the name?
So when we founded the company, Sidney Brenner, I don't know if you know Sidney Brenner, he was actually the guy behind mRNA. He was the South African laureate who founded the genetic codons, the stop codons in genetic code that are a lot of what are used today, and he named them amber, umber, and ochre. So he passed away the year we started the company, and we named it ochre after him as a testament to his work. And I have a South African co-founder I mentioned, so there's that.
I like that story more than a convoluted one involving clay, dirt, and earth. that fits a lot better for a public audience. It kind of fits a little more with the ethos of the
company. Amen. There was someone in the company recently told me that their ochre was originally founded near Oxford, or there was some ochre mine in the 1700s that was like the biggest source of global ochre. Anyway, so there may be some other layers to it we weren't aware of. And the liver is sort of ochre, if it gets diseased, it kind of goes up. Anyway, there may be other.
Don't go with that one.
No, I think we'll stick to our story.
Stick with the Nobel laureate. Stick with the Nobel laureate. Yeah. We offer free marketing advice on this show.
Thank you.
So yeah, stick with the Nobel laureate.
Very much appreciated.
Anytime, we'll send you a bill. All right, so we are down to about the last 5 minutes here, and we like to kind of look into the future. So I would say I would think about liver disease here and how you think about working in a space that is just littered with failure, right? You know, you're in a very different, you know, as wonderful and awesome as all of this sounds, you are in a very difficult kind of clinical, a very difficult clinical area. How do you think about and balance the past, if you will, with what you're trying to do? And how do you think about what your next steps are going to be, knowing full well that this is probably a very difficult road?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely poses a lot of challenges from a fundraising perspective, just given how many people have been burned by liver disease in the past. I think from a clinical perspective, I mean, ultimately, it's a massive unmet medical need. That and a lot, like when you look back on the initial NASH drugs, that when there was a lot of excitement around the space and everyone was throwing their hat into the ring, a lot of it was repurposed anti-fibrotics or diabetic drugs and so on. There wasn't a lot of nuance or thought put into the actual trying to study and understand the disease in a systematic way to get to what is the most likely intervention for patients. So we try to be clear about the approach from early days that we've taken to very carefully build out therapeutics that we think have a higher probability of success when we go into the clinic. And ultimately, I mean, the data will enable us to say that with confidence or not. And we're over the next year now, as we begin to put our lead therapeutics into this liver perfusion model, we'll be in a much stronger place to make those arguments. But I think the way we've laid out the path and taken a look at what are the challenges holding back this space, and then try to approach each of them sequentially and make sure we're setting ourselves up for success. In the words of Vinod and so on, we're taking a very ambitious swing in a very challenging space, but doing so in as thoughtful a way I think one can. So we're optimistic, but yeah, there definitely are headwinds ahead.
But you're also using those headwinds and the learnings,
exactly,
right,
yeah,
that were generated from that in order to do it differently and hopefully be more successful for patients.
Exactly. And I mean, there needs to be novel approaches to these types of diseases. It requires weird and wonderful companies to try and crack these big challenges, rather than another Me Too ASK1 inhibitor, another one of the traditional targets. If we're going to make an impact on the space, I think we need to really think differently about it, which has been a lot of the founding thesis at Ochre.
Yeah. We want you to get to the point where you're high-fiving in the UK.
Yeah, I want to be high-fiving in the hallway. I don't know if it'll ever happen in the UK. That's why we set up the New York lab, just so we could do more high-five.
Come on over and high-five, right?
That's fine. I don't know if we've explored that as kind of a cultural concept, but for people that need that, just reinforcement, high-five type recognition, that if New York ever needs to open just, I don't know, kind of a happiness office where people can celebrate a little bit more, I think that's fine. It's a short flight over here from the UK. It's not that difficult to do. Yeah. I think one of the exciting things here is you've taken something that is, has classically been incredibly difficult, and you're doing almost nothing to tradition. You've had the boldness to say these things have not worked in the past, so we're not going to do them, and we're going to do them differently. And that is probably scary for some people, but honestly, that's how, I hope that we're going to get better translation out of things. It takes a lot of, I guess, bravery to say, okay, well, these are the classic mouse liver models, but we're going to say that these don't work, and we're going to kind of build our own. And I think that's a really exciting thing that you're doing.
Thank you. We hope so too. And we'll be high-fiving in New York next time
I will absolutely high-five you the next time you're in New York. We can even film it and post it on Twitter. I'm perfectly good with that.
Looking forward to that already.
Yeah. Jack, thank you so much for joining us today. As Derek said, we look forward to high-fiving you in person at the New York Bio event. We'll let everybody get in on the fun. We really appreciate your time and what you're trying to do. So, and thirdly, the fact that you're doing it partially in New York. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope you have a great Tuesday, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks everybody. And thanks Jack.
Everybody.
Bye now.